everyone. We will go ahead and get started. We welcome you today to Virtual Writing Conference. This is one of our Summer Learning Blitz sessions, so we're so glad you could join us today. I'm here today with Debbie Reeves, one of the literacy consultants at Wayne Risa. And Debbie comes with a ton of experience, both in reading recovery. She has a special education background and over 4 decades of educational experience. So we're so glad that Debbie can be with us today just so we can learn from her. I'm also with my colleague Judy Bowling, who's instructional technology, and she's manning the chat for us. So anything that you might need to ask in the chat, she'll make sure your questions get lifted to the group. So we encourage you to make use of Judy's expertise as well. And I'm Michelle Wagner. I'm also one of the literacy consultants at Wayne Risa, and I'm excited to join you today. As we begin, we'd like to encourage you to use that chat function just to introduce yourself so that we can see who's in the room. And then if at any point you have a question that you would like one of the facilitators to respond to, if you could use the Q&A section for that, and we'll monitor for questions and comments. One thing to keep in mind, we are using Zoom webinar today. So you'll want to make sure if you're using that chat that you're choosing all panelists and attendees. By default, it goes just to all panelists. So you'll want to include all panelists and attendees if you'd like to share any ideas with your colleagues in the room. We are also putting a link to a reflection guide if this helps you keep track of today's session with some notes or ideas that you might want to include. Please make use of this tool. If this doesn't help you, we also encourage you just to follow along and listen. And again, share any of your ideas in that chat with us. We know that the smartest person in the room is always the room itself. So please lift any ideas that you might have for us. With that, I'm going to throw it over to Debbie.
Hi. The focus of today being on writing conferences, we wanted to kind of find out where you folks are in your experience and comfort level in conducting writing conferences. So you'll see on the screen, there's the 5, I'm in love with it and I've been doing it forever, or 1, I kind of turned green at the mention of writing conferences, or I just don't have a lot of experience. So as we proceed, if you could take a minute and just go down to the chat box, just type in a number by your name so we kind of get a feel for our audience. And while you're doing that, we're going to kind of review the outcomes for our session today. What we'd like to increase awareness of includes the value of writing conferences. Why would we do it? Why would we fit it into our schedule? There's a basic structure for all writing conferences, so we're going to talk about that. We want to share a number of resources that we want to encourage you to check out to support you in your conferences. And of course, Michelle, our technology expert here, as well as literacy, she's going to share tools and techniques to help us switch over to the virtual. But our real big goal here is that you go out of here chanting Cody Waldrop's title book, I can do it, I will do it. So we want you motivated to at least dive into writing conferences this year in whatever format we end up in. And with that, Judy, we were wondering, what does our group look like?
Well, it looks like we have a little all over the place, but it looks like the majority of people are feeling that they're at a 3, so kind of in the middle. But we've got 1 5, a couple 2s, couple 4s, but mostly some 3s, so a little all over the place.
Kind of like a real classroom.
Right.
But we're gonna move everybody toward that 5 eventually, hopefully, to get you started in that direction at least today. First of all, we want to convince you that this is worth it. It's a lot of work, but why would we confer, especially in this setting? And there are so many benefits to holding conferences with our kids. The first one is actually in a silver lining, if we end up staying in the virtual setting, that this is actually in some ways easier to do than some other instructional strategies and topic areas, because really you don't need extra resources. You don't have to locate books to get into kids' hands and that kind of thing. So it can be easier with just a few technology tools under your belt. Also, sitting down side by side or virtually with one student or a small group really gives you a lot of formative assessment information that you're going to need if you're going to individualize instruction and target their individual needs. This one's really huge, especially now in this pandemic. It really is going to help you build relationships. because it's so much more intimate. And if you think about it, it's going to be a lot different even than it was in the spring, because those kids you already had a relationship with. Whereas now, if we stay virtual to start the year, it's going to be even more necessary that we have a vehicle for building those necessary relationships with our kids. And also, a primary goal is to help kids think of themselves as writers. We often ask teachers, do you think of yourself as a reader? And everybody says, oh, of course. But not all say they think of themselves as writers, and we want to change that. We want our kids just walking out of our classroom like, I am a writer from day one. Also, we know if you tailor it down to a small group, and heavens, one-on-one, the specific feedback that we're able to offer our kids really leads to targeted instruction, and that's huge. We know the research of John Hattie has shown that how important feedback is to promoting learning. And so even though it can be challenging, we really want to make time for conferring. I know in the regular face-to-face classroom setting, that's often a challenge. It's like, well, I have such a big class size, how am I going to fit it in? But when you think about the values of conferring, it's worth the effort. With that said, we know, especially at the elementary level, there's just a lot of spinning plates in literacy instruction. There's a lot of different instructional strategies that kids need, but where conferring would fit in is typically during the writing workshop when kids are writing independently, and that's the time when you would be able to sit down with kids individually or even in small groups. This is another graphic just to show the big chunks. We do have a reading workshop, typically a chunk of time devoted to reading, not that you don't write in response to reading in that section, but the writing workshop is devoted exclusively to the art of writing. How do you become a better writer? And our time for conferencing is during the biggest chunk of that time when kids normally would be independently writing. But we want to point out another silver lining to a remote setting, because think of it, one of the most challenging things is, what are the other kids doing while I'm sitting down with one student or a small group? Well, we don't have to deal with that issue right now, so we can even start conferring sooner this year to build those important relationships than we might normally have, because usually at the beginning of the year you have to work on that stamina and helping kids learn to be independent when they're not with you. Not so in a remote setting. So another silver lining.
One thing that I really like to keep in mind when I'm thinking about writing conferences is throughout our Learning Blitz series, we've really been focused on taking those literacy essentials and looking at how they fit. You know, they work face-to-face, but really thinking about how they might also work if we're engaging in online or remote instruction. And writing conferences, just like Debbie said, are so easy to do online when we think about it in terms of all of the complex ideas that we're trying to implement. Writing conferences are rather easy to do online. And I say that because I know from my own children, the teachers were really reaching out to them and trying to connect with them. But if you've ever had a conversation, a phone call with a second grade boy, there's not a lot of back and forth because his answers are typically one word. Same with young girls. They're just uncomfortable on the phone. But the moment you put a piece of writing in front of them, it anchors the conversation and actually makes that conversation much easier because now you have something to talk about. So it gets away from those 1 or 2 word answers and really starts focusing on a larger topic. We also want to encourage you to check out the online modules at literacyessentials.org. These are great, especially if you dive into essential number 6, which is all about writing. We'd encourage you just to check these out. They're free. They're always available. It's something that you can access at your leisure. It's not something you even have to complete. If you want to go on and just check out a little bit at a time, please feel free to do that. It's absolutely a wonderful resource for professional development on demand.
And one thing that we wanted to share about this site too is there are a wealth of videos. So if you're like me and you want to see a strategy in action, you can actually watch those that were filmed throughout our state. So they're real Michigan teachers, real Michigan students, and excellent examples of all of these practices. So as Michelle mentioned, when you think of writing with the essential practices, it's all about essential 6. But as we always think about each of these practices, it's not just the header that we pay attention to. Each bullet underneath is just cram-packed with lots of information. And if you think about it, of all the 10 essentials, only one is explicitly devoted to writing. So it's really a lot packed in there. So you'll notice from the K-3 document, the connection with the 4-5, they align with each other pretty nicely, that it's really important that we get kids writing every day in some form. Obviously, the writing processes and explicit instruction and strategies is expected. This is huge, providing kids with opportunities to study models, what we call mentor texts, so they can see what published authors, and sometimes not published authors, it could also be teacher or students writing samples, how a strategy is employed in an actual text. And of course, we want to hit on all three main forms of writing: opinion, informative, and narrative. And the same thing is true in the 4-5. You'll see the same things reflected in their essential 6: daily time, explicit instruction, and mentor texts of the 3 different types of writing. So yes, essential 6 is exclusively focused on writing instruction, but we have to look through the other practices, because as we know, reading and writing are reciprocal. And the fact that this essential practice is number 1 is intentional, because as Jennifer Saravallo says, without engagement, you've got nothing. And essential 1 is all about motivation and engagement. So we always have to keep in mind how we're going to get kids motivated to do that large quantity of writing that we want them to be doing. And again, here's number 1 bullet. We have to find ways to have kids think of themselves as writers right away, that they can do this, that this is a meaningful activity for them and they are able to do it. And one way is by allowing them to make choices. They can choose the topics that they write about. Gone are the days of the assigned writing tasks. We might be studying a particular genre, so they might be asked to write within that genre, but giving them choices of topic selection is so critical. And we need to provide kids with plenty of opportunity to have collaborative discussions within the writing process. And kids need to know that that's how published writers work, that they have writing circles and they offer each other feedback all the time before a book goes to print. And also helping kids understand the purposes for writing, that this is a worthwhile activity that they want to partake in. In fact, this is so important, motivation, engagement. In Jennifer's book, many of you are probably really familiar with this. It's a wonderful resource, the Writing Strategies book. A whole chunk of that is devoted just to strategies to get kids engaged in the writing process. The bottom line for writing conferences, though, is what works in face-to-face is the structure of it is the same in virtual, and we have to try to find ways to make it as consistent as we can to replicate what goes on in the classroom. So what are the big ideas for conferring? The first thing is just to think of this as a conversation. While you may have your millions of notes and your little bag of tricks, we want for kids to feel like it's a conversation between their teacher and themselves. And this is really important to remember, that a conference is not to fix a particular piece of writing the student's working on at the time, but help them become better writers on anything they write about. One thing that's going to make conferences easier is to understand that it has a predictable structure, and we'll be talking about that. And this is important too, that it's not just the teacher that has a role in this, but the student needs to know that they are expected to participate as well. And that helps to build that writerly identity as well. So they need to be taught what their role looks like. And so teaching them is going to really make a huge difference. And we'll talk a little bit more about that later. It's really important, as in any interaction with our kids, though, that we also make sure that they understand we care about them as people as well as writers. This is Carl Anderson. If you haven't heard of him, he is all about conferring, an excellent, well, he's now an expert in conferring, although as you'll hear later, he's confessed that he didn't start out that way, as no one does. But he's now known as the Conferring guy. This is his actual first book. And he breaks down the structure of a conference this way. You might find it tweaked a little differently in, say, a Lucy Calkins description, but basically they do all have the same components. The conference starts with first sitting down, and you might start with Carl's opening question, how's it going? But your goal here is to assess what is the student working on and where are they as a writer. And swirling around in your head are lots of where am I going to go with this? Like what might be teaching points? So as you're listening to the student and having that conversation, those are the things you're thinking about.
There's a question that Danielle asked us. I was wondering if this information could be used in a Head Start setting.
Yes, actually, we at RISA are offering the pre-kindergarten essential training program. So eventually, probably you'll hear more about that later. But yes, writing is expected at a developmental level at the pre-K setting. And a lot of the techniques that we're going to be talking about today can be used at any setting with developmentally appropriate goals, of course. So the second part of a conference is to give the student feedback. So telling them something positive that they are already doing as a writer. And we know that many of time they're not even aware of what they've done. So we want to bring that to the fore of their thinking so that they can become intentional in their use of writing strategies by pointing out what they're already doing that writers do. And then comes the challenging part is like, what one thing am I going to teach today? There could be a million different teaching points, but we're going to hone in on one today. What do I think is going to nudge the student forward as a writer today the best? And fear not, if there's another one that pops into your head as you're driving home, oh, I should have used that teaching point. There'll be another conference down the road. Then you have the kids usually have a go at the strategy, and that doesn't mean that they're going to sit there and write everything out. They could just do it, say what they were going to write, so they're trying a strategy. So we coach them at that point to try it out before they go off on their own. And then we finally end with the link, and the link is basically just to convey to the child that this is a strategy that writers use, and you can use it with anything that you're writing in this genre. So basically, starting with how's it going, asking questions. When you're asking questions during your assessment point, be cautious about not jumping in with the first thing that comes to your mind. Take a little time to consider lots of things the student is doing before you seize upon a teaching point, because guaranteed there'll be many that come to your mind. And also, you don't have to have the student read the whole piece. It's nice if you have access to the piece ahead of time, and that actually might be more often likely to happen in the remote setting than even in the classroom. You're already familiar with what they're writing, and you can just get a taste of it before you move into the teaching section. Again, the teaching decision has to be limited. We don't want to try to overwhelm the child with too many different strategies at once, so pick one and go with it. So we've kind of gone through this, give the student feedback, and what's important about feedback is be as specific as possible. Really tell them what a strategy that writers do that they're doing. Not, great job. Boy, it's really exciting what you wrote. We want to be specific. Specific feedback is what's going to move learning forward. And then teaching the teaching point. What is the strategy we're going to teach today? It's really powerful to use a mentor text so kids can actually see how other authors like themselves have employed that strategy. And we have them have a go and then help them to understand. I'm going to check back later, see how you've employed that, and that this can be used anytime you write. The important point is that we stay focused on the goal. So when we finish a conference, we know what it is we taught them specifically that they can use on any piece of writing that they pick up. Sometimes it seems overwhelming and, well, what do I teach them? What do I teach them about being a great writer? Well, obviously you're going to check out the standards and take a look at that for your grade level, as well as your district curriculum. And there's a resource at RESA, the Mesa Geln Units of Study for writing and reading. So if you go to the link that's in the chat box, you can visit that, hit browse, and just put in your grade level, and it will come up with a lot of great ideas for lessons to help kids move forward. An important thing when we start our conference and we're doing that assessment is we have to think, what is our main goal? And that's to be creating lifelong writers. You can have a lot of skill, but if you don't employ it, it's for naught. There's different ways to focus on things. What we like, the way Carl Anderson has pulled them out into 3 goals. In a lifelong writer, this one is often forgotten or overlooked, that a lifelong writer has initiative. So we want them actually choosing to write. So we need to be mindful of how we can promote that. Lifelong writers have initiative, then they have all those strategies that allow them to write well. That means the quality of writing, and those are descriptors that we're more familiar with: developing voice, use of conventions, organized structure, and so on. And of course, we want lifelong writers to utilize the writing process and have tools and strategies that allow them to do that. This is another great resource. This is Carl's second book, Assessing Writers, that you'll have access to in the chat. But it really is helpful as if you're uncomfortable with what writers need to possess in their toolkit to be good writers. That would be a great resource. Assessing writers to determine strengths and teaching points in all of those 3 areas of our main goal of developing lifelong writers. So a lot of what we do in conferences are questioning, because we want kids thinking like writers, and we want them to know that writers make a lot of decisions as they're heading out. So a number 1 initiative skill is for kids to understand why they're writing. Writers have a purpose. They have a message to convey. And we want kids thinking, why are you writing this? And hopefully the answer eventually is not just because my teacher told me to write. That's not our goal. We want kids to know that writing is such a useful skill. We want kids exposed to a variety of genre. So when they go to write a piece, it's going to be up to them to pick a genre in their independent writing. So why? Why did you pick that? Why did you decide to write an opinion piece? What was your purpose? And this one too is often overlooked. Who's your audience? And again, hopefully the audience is not just, well, my teacher. That's the least motivating audience, especially when you get up in grades, that you can think of. So we want kids to be mindful that writers think about who's going to read this, and that helps them make decisions about what they're going to write. In the writing process, asking for the rehearsal part, what steps will you use to write this piece? And hopefully you're noticing that with all of these, what strategies are you using in editing? How are you helping the reader to understand this by going back and checking punctuation and all of that? All of these questions really convey to our students that writers make lots of decisions. So there again, you're building that sense of a writer identity, that they have control of a lot when they write. And there's a lot of intentional thinking that goes on in making decisions. A quality we're probably very familiar with. You may have been familiar with traits, but we want to make sure that kids know that when you write, you have a purpose, you have a message to convey. And sometimes they just say, I'm going to write about, and they name a topic, but they don't really have a message about it. They're just going to tell you all about it. So we want to start developing that intentional narrowing of their focus and think about, what is your actual message? What do you want the readers to take away from this? Being aware of genre and what's typical in a genre as far as how they're organized. and the structure too. How are the choices you're making to organize your writing, helping the reader to understand? Because we always want to bring it back to how are you helping the reader? Because somebody's going to actually read this. And of course, we're familiar with details, and not details for detail's sake, but again, it's to support the meaning of the writing. How do your individual voice come through in your writing? And of course, we know conventions. But basically, lots of questioning goes on in the conference because we want kids thinking deeply about their writing. And if you think about it, the more they're thinking about their writing, the more they're going to have to contribute to the writing conference. We want to share with you some resources that will help you in determining the teaching points, knowing where to go to focus. We're going to share with you our number one recommendation of Carl Anderson's is his newest book, which we'll talk about in a little bit. But this is also an excellent resource. I know many of you are already familiar with it, Lucy Calkins' Writing Pathways. This is a tool. So it helps you with learning progressions, and you can see how Lucy organizes the writing qualities, structure, development, language conventions, and it shows how these develop across grade levels. So you can really kind of pinpoint where your student is. Also included are just so many resources. Here's a couple more. Teaching rubrics that you can use. You can see this one highlighted here is going to apply to Liam, who we'll see in a writing conference in just a bit, a grade 2 student. That would be for the teacher, but if you look over on the right, they also have student-friendly writing checklists, which are wonderful, again, to support students developing independence as writers, that they can check through and make sure that they're applying writing strategies that they're learning about. So this would be a great one for Liam, who is going to be working on varying the types of facts, information that he adds to his writing. Again, with the focus on motivation and engagement, developing that independence in writing, it's important to include students in setting goals for their writing. So doing it together, letting them in. Of course, you massage the conference to head in a direction that you know is going to be most supportive of the student, but we do want them to play a role. We have a link that you can watch Jennifer Saravallo doing a writing conference with a first grader, Ella. And what I just wanted to point out is she has a little sticky note there, and to help guide the student in selecting where she thinks that she needs to set as a goal. So in her case, she has a lot going on in her writing, and so they mutually decide on focus. So including students in setting their own goals promotes independence and ups motivation. Can't stress enough, we could do 3 sessions, 4 sessions on mentor texts, but there's nothing more powerful than showing kids what other writers do and having them learn from them applying strategies. So you might want to start selecting some texts that you think you can get a lot of mileage out of, that demonstrate a lot of strong teaching points that you might be using with your students, and just collecting all of this stuff into what we call a conferring toolkit, so you have it at the ready. This is Gail Gibbons' book called Dinosaurs that actually we're going to use in more than one conference. So we'll see that in a minute. We're going to see Liam now, long awaited, in an actual conference with his wonderful teacher. I think her name is Mrs. Wagner. But while you're watching this, look for those parts, the structure of a conference: research, decide, teach, have a go, and the link.
Liam.
Hi, Miss Wagner.
How are you?
Good.
Good. I got that writing that you sent to me yesterday. Did you send that with your cell phone, or did your mom send it to me?
My mom sent it to you.
Awesome. Is it okay if I share my screen so I can show you what I saw?
Mm-hmm.
Do you have your writing with you?
Yeah.
Awesome. All right, I'm going to share my screen for a second. and you're going to see your writing because I took that message that your mom sent and I put it right here so that I could look at it too, okay? Does that look familiar?
Yeah.
Yeah, is that what you have on your desk too?
Uh-huh.
Perfect. All right, can you go ahead and read to me what you wrote?
One day I was going to summer camp at the rec center. There is a big forest there. There are a ton of baby acorns on the trees. One of the trees died is now just a pile of wood chips.
Awesome, thank you for sharing that with me. Looks like you have an entire paragraph there, that's great. One thing I wanted to know is what you wanted help with writing. Is there something that you wanted to focus on?
I'm really bad at making like capital letters when I'm supposed to. And like that.
You know, I'm looking at this and you did a pretty good job with that. Can I remind you of a couple of things that we've been working on in class together?
Mm.
Do you remember these? These are from our writing class, and these are some of our things that we've been studying. So we looked at choosing a topic and focusing. And I actually think you did a really good job with both of these things. You chose a topic that you were an expert at that summer camp, and you picked just one part of summer camp. So you didn't focus on the whole thing, you focused just on the forest. And you did add lots of facts, but I'm wondering if we could focus in on maybe adding action facts. Do you think that would be a good thing?
Yeah.
All right, so wonderful. So we'll look at adding action facts. Can we start by, I want to remind you about that story that we read just a few days ago in our read aloud. Do you remember this one by Gail Gibbons, Dinosaurs?
Yeah.
Yeah? So if you look at here, let's read what she wrote. One of the very biggest of all dinosaurs was Brachiosaurus. It stood about 40 feet tall and was 80 feet long. Brachiosauruses liked eating water plants too. Do you see how Gail Gibbons starts the same way you do in your writing? She starts listing facts, right? She tells us how tall Brachiosaurus is and that he's one of the biggest dinosaurs that there was. Just like you started by telling me some of the things that were at summer camp. You started by telling me there was a forest and that there were baby acorns on the trees and that even one of the trees died. So you've got lots of those facts, but I was wondering if we could add some action facts. So Gail Gibbons writes that the Brachiosaurus liked eating water plants. So that is an action fact. So can you give me an action fact about the forest at the rec center? What is something you did, an action that you did in the forest?
I take walks in there.
That is a great example of an action fact. Where would you put that in your writing? If I look at your writing, where could that go?
Okay, so after baby acorns, like right before the dead tree.
Ooh.
I can say it.
So what would you write there?
I take walks by the rec center.
So that's a great example of an action fact. So I'm going to let you go ahead and edit your writing, but do you think that we could come back together and talk about this again maybe tomorrow? And you could share what you've done differently and what you've added?
Mm-hmm.
All right, off you go.
Hopefully you notice what a calm conversational tone Mrs. Wagner had with her student, and we want to make it as natural as possible.
Deb, as a part of the conference, we have a question from Stephen, and he's wondering if feedback is a part of the conference.
Definitely. I think that you start with what they're doing well. So even though he identified what he wanted to work on, Mrs. Wagner shared that he's actually doing very well with using capitals in his writing. But yeah, the more you can point out something that you've noticed that they're using, Like Liam also, given what they've been studying, he also did a nice job using descriptive facts. And so the more you can point things like that out to them, they become more intentional with future writing.
Well, and one thing, Debbie, I would say that didn't maybe translate as well is when I was in my classroom, I always told my students at the end of any writing conference or mini lesson, off you go. And it just seems kind of silly to do virtually. So you might want to just say goodbye, because you laughed at me when I said, off you go.
I love it personally, but.
So when we think about Google Slides, some ways that I used it in this writing conference were just to create the anchor chart itself. And I actually like using Google Slides for anchor charts because you can give each student their own individual copy, and then you can always have it at the ready. So if you are engaged in remote instruction, you can pull those up in a slide, just like you would in a classroom, maybe point to an anchor chart, but you're utilizing that in your work. So I was able to remind Liam of exactly what we had covered during our mini lessons because I had that ready. Another tool that I use quite a bit, especially in writing conferences, is this idea of Google Keep. So Google Keep might be a new tool for you, but it is part of the G Suite. So it's accessed in the same way that you might access Google Docs or Google Slides. And that's within that waffle at google.com. Or you can go right to it by keep.google.com. And it's one of the few apps in Google that I actually like the mobile app better than the desktop app, but I do use the desktop app a lot. So when you think about what Google Keep is, it really is just a way to organize and keep notes at the ready and reminders. So those are the two features I use a lot. So I really like the reminder for things like if I want to remember to grab a certain book, but I'm not going to be in my office for a few weeks, I can add into my reminders that I want to, the next time I'm at that location, get a reminder on my phone to pick up a certain text or a certain thing. So it's very helpful in that way. But the notes are what I used for this conference. And so when you think about what I really was doing with Liam during that conference is I was coaching him on what to do next in his writing. I wanted him to acknowledge where he was in his writing and just nudge him forward, which if we think about small group instruction, that's exactly what we should be doing. And there's no smaller group than one-on-one instruction. So for Liam, we had some focus areas. So here on the right, I had some of the things that Liam and I had been working on. So you can see there, and on the end of April, we were brainstorming a list that he might be an expert at so that he could pick a topic. And then we were focusing on one specific piece of what he chose. So, and then there it was on May 6th, we actually started working on adding those action facts. So I was able just to keep track in my notes, just what was happening. And I used Google Keep to do that. I can also add collaborators to these notes, which is really helpful when you're working with, I would say, second and third graders in particular, and then all the way up, because you can add the students themselves to the notes so they can be reminded of what it is that we're working on. You can also set a reminder so that if you do set up a conference, you can get a reminder, and so can the student, so that the child remembers, hey, I have a conference with Miss Wagner tomorrow. It just helps us all stay on task. So to prepare for the conference, I used a Google slide deck just because that's what helps me. His mom had sent me a copy of his writing, so I have that right there, kind of blown up to take up the whole slide so that I could see it and so could he. And then if you notice over on the right, there's that little arrow pointing to that yellow light bulb, which you've probably seen and maybe ignored whenever you're in slides. But if you click on that, what happens is it will open up your Google Keep notepad. And so here I was able to actually look at both my slide deck and my writing conference for Liam. So you can notice there at the top of that panel, the word Liam, I actually searched my notes for Liam's name so that I could focus on just those notes for him, which is handy. And then I still have both the anchor chart that I wanted to reference and then a couple of screenshots from that book that we had been reading and that we were using as an anchor text. So it's just a way just to have everything in one place so that I'm not fumbling around navigating for everything. And it's also a way for me to be prepared for that conference. So it's definitely a different animal than when you're in your classroom and you can just run over to the bookshelf and grab it. So you have to do a little bit more prep there. Another thing that I use a lot is Google Calendar. And Google Calendar, I mean, we're talking very self-explanatory in terms of just keeping myself organized, but creating those conferences within Google Calendar can just help us keep ourselves organized. One thing that I encourage my third graders to do is to actually, I would encourage them to keep track of their own calendar and actually send the invites. When we think about asking students to write for multiple purposes, this is one of those purposes. We use calendar invites in our grown-up world, and students are going to use them as well. So if we can encourage our students to click on that more options and just create a narrative that tells us what it is that we were going to focus on. So if I was asking Liam to do this, he might put what his goal was for the next time we met so that he was reminded of not just that we were meeting, but what it was that we were going to look at. So it's just a way to get your students involved in that process to take a little bit of workload off of you as the third grade teacher. Now, if you're teaching below third grade, you might have to explicitly teach this, and this might not be something your very young learners would want to do quite yet. If you're not using Google, that's not a problem. There are other tools that you can use. So just instead of using Google Slides, you might make use of PowerPoint, and instead of using Google Calendar, of course, Outlook will work as well. If you're using Office 360, many of those interactive pieces that I did with Liam would also work with these products as well. So it's just a matter of looking at what you have and choosing the tool that works for you. We have created a little video of just all of those steps that I just explained, but in a video form. So we're going to put a link into the chat, but it's also part of this slide deck. So you can come back to it later and just watch a few minutes video to show you everything that I kind of walked through just now in a different way. So if you'd like to review any of those steps, that's a tool for you.
So most of our examples are of one-on-one conferences, but we want you to know that you can do this in a small group as well. You can even embed a one-on-one conference within a small group gathering, similar to what you might do in your reading small group instruction, where you zoom in on one child reading aloud while the others read silently. It's kind of similar in a writing conference group. Here, if you're going to do it remotely, is a little tip that might make this possible. So you can see Mrs. Wagner is working with a small group of kids, and but she wants to zoom in and confer one-on-one with Liam. And to do that, Liam has to unmute his mic as well as turn up his sound on his computer. And then they can have a private conversation while the other three kids continue on with their writing, because they still have their mute on and their volume down from their computer. And then when she's ready to move to another student, she just holds up their name, and Liam knows to, again, mute and turn down his sound. And then when they're ready to have an entire group conversation, everybody unmutes and turns up the sound because the teacher's held up an all card. So it's a low-tech way of managing a high-tech little small group setting.
So with that, we did want to share just one more quick example of a small group giving feedback on Liam's writing. And as you watch just think about how you might be able to implement small group writing conferences with your students. So Debbie, if you wouldn't mind clicking play.
Hello everyone, we're here today with Liam, and Liam has been practicing writing for information, and he wanted to share his writing with all of you and get some feedback about what he could do better. So I'm projecting Liam's writing on the screen so that you can see it. And Liam, can you share with everyone what you wrote?
Yes. One day I was going to summer camp at the rec center. There's a big forest there. There are a ton of baby acorns on the trees. I like to walk on the trails of the rec center. One of the trees died and is now just a pile of acorns.
Liam, is it okay if we ask our friends to share some ideas of how we can make that, maybe add more information to make it even more fun to listen to?
Sure.
Okay, what ideas do we have? How can he make that better?
Maybe in some places, instead of there just only being periods, maybe there could be like a few exclamation points.
How would that change what he was saying?
Instead of it just being like, at the forest at the rec center, there were a bunch of trees with baby acorns. It would just be like, at the trails in the rec center, there are a whole bunch of trees with baby acorns. So it would actually give it like voice. But the acorn trees aren't in the trails. They're like right in front of the trails.
So maybe that's a piece of information you could add, Liam, in extra detail. Beckett, what would you do to make this better? What information would you like him to add?
Oh, I would write more about the forest, maybe? I don't know. Yeah, what else is there and stuff?
Awesome, that's a great idea. Liam, do you think you could tell us more about what's there in your writing?
There are big trips there. Or like, who is with you? And like, no one.
Hey, thank you, those are great ideas. Aubrey, is there any idea that you have on how you might be able to improve?
I'm just still thinking a little bit more. I have some ideas, but I don't know.
Well, thank you all, and maybe we could set up a time where Aubrey could look at it with Liam, and Liam, maybe you could read it one more time with some of the suggestions that Emma and Beckett made, and you could add even more thoughts, okay? All right, thank you, everyone. Bye.
So that is just an example of the way that a student might share his writing with classmates, so that he's getting actual feedback from classmates and peers. And we know that students take a little bit more care and put a little more effort into a piece if they feel like they're going to have an authentic audience. So giving them that audience can make a big difference. We do have another video for you that we're not going to show today, but we just want you to know that it's there. And Judy will go ahead and put a link into the chat. What this is a one-on-one peer feedback. So it's just reiterating the fact that it doesn't matter the size of the group, just giving students the chance to share their writing can make a big difference. We also want to just share the idea of encouraging your students to publish their writing. Even if we are in the remote setting, we know that so many of our students aren't able to access high-speed internet reliably. And so we may be forced to send home packets and information like that. And including a publishing kit in that packet of information that the students use can make all the difference. So sending home little booklets instead of just paper, so that students can see that they're creating books and not just separate sheets of paper, can make a big difference. And I'm a huge fan of colored duct tape. Colored duct tape to cover up the staples can turn just a regular story into a masterpiece to a child, because it really does make them feel as if they've published something spectacular. So I'd encourage you to just think about maybe some creative ways that you might help students just design their own little home publishing kit.
So this is a published story, informational text. So we're gonna just take a look at it and look for what do we think would be our next focus for our next conference. What would be our teaching point? What would we want to focus on with this student? This is a first grader writing on how to grow suckers. So I'm just going to flip through slowly, and as you review Lana's writing of her published book, think about the next step. What would you work on next? She's a first grader. I love this. Wait one day, then bright and early, you grew suckers. So likely at this point, One focus for Lana might be conventions, specifically capital letters. When we give her some feedback on this, she's already doing great using periods. You can see she's picking that up. So we want to nudge her forward toward adding a capital letter to start the next sentence. And as you look in the standards for the conventions, you'll see that for capital letters in first grade, the focus is on capitalizing dates and names of people. So just starting a sentence with a capital letter is actually a kindergarten goal. So yes, that might be something that we would encourage Lana to do, to reread her writing, to make sure that every period is followed by a capital letter. But how to do that? Even for this, if you think back to when you were in school, how did you learn this? After every period comes a capital letter to start a new sentence. But how much more powerful it is to still use a mentor text to show how an author used this convention well, and to talk about how it helps you understand what the author's message is. So much better than just spouting rules. And again, notice we're still using the same mentor text. So when you pick a mentor text, pick something that you love, that you find that you think your students also will love, and look for different writing strategies that you can highlight, because there are many in one book. You don't have to have a new book every time you sit down to confer. So you would just read this and show how, oh, look, Gail Gibbons, here's a period. What do you see next? And it's much more powerful. And why is that? Why did she use this? It's to help us understand her message better. Speaking of published books, we always want to find authentic purposes for students' writing and have their writing be as authentic as possible. And for those of you who teach our youngest kids, we really want to encourage giving them blank books rather than just sheets of paper. Because if you think about it, their greatest exposure in school to what writing is through the lovely read-alouds that they listen to every day. And authors wrote those books. So if I'm going to be thinking of myself as a writer, then I should be making books too. I can do this. So just like authors make books, we want kids to think of themselves as authors. And by giving them, and you can ask parents just to throw together a few sheets of paper and just staple them together, and that's a book. And they can be making books just like their favorite authors. Again, if you're working with the youngest kids, another text that we want to highly recommend is also from that same series, Classroom Essentials series at Heinemann. And it's a teacher's guide to getting started with those beginning writers, K2. And Katie Wood-Ray and Lisa Cleveland provide a wealth of video examples included in this to see it in action, even with our youngest kids. And if you there's a link that's going into the chat that you can visit the Heinemann site and actually see Lisa's classroom, kindergarten classroom, and you'll see kindergartners literally on the first day of school making books. Okay, this sounds really easy, right? There's a lot going on with conferences. There's a lot of prep work, I know, and we want you to take heart. If you remember back to the outcomes for today, we want you going out of here saying, I can do it and I will do it. And it's encouraging to note that even the masters had disastrous conferences in their early days. We've had Carl at Wayne Reese a number of times, and he always confesses. So we thought, how better to encourage you than to listen to Carl Anderson discuss his first conference and how it went.
My first writing conference was a disaster. No one has a gene that makes him or her good at conferring. Most of us, in fact, have failed in our first attempts at conferring with our young writers, even the most skilled among us today. In the fall of 1987, I was the second-year teacher at a small Catholic grammar school in the Bronx. I had read about writing workshop in Lucy Calkin's book, The Art of Teaching Writing, and I was especially intrigued by the writing conferences she described in its pages, which seemed like an excellent way to teach my students, who had such diverse needs as writers. After I gave my first mini-lesson and my students began writing, I looked around my classroom until my eyes settled upon Saida, a thoughtful, studious girl, I imagined that if I sat down and conferred with her, she would probably say something smart and interesting about what she was doing as a writer, just like the children in the conferences that Calkins had described in The Art of Teaching Writing, and that in response I would have the opportunity to teach her something important. I walked over to Saida's desk, knelt down next to her and smiled. She stopped writing and looked up at me nervously. I asked, "How's it going?" Saida said nothing. Instead, she looked at me as if she were deer caught in headlights. Unfazed, I glanced at her writing and said, "How's it going with your writing?" Saida looked at her writing for a moment, then back at me. Finally, she answered my question. "Mr. Anderson, it's going okay," she said. I felt disappointed and panicked. Saida hadn't shared anything about what she was trying to do as a writer, and thus hadn't given me any direction about what I might teach her in the conference. Since I didn't know what to do next, I ended the conversation by saying, "Saida, I'm really glad it's going okay." Then I walked back to my desk and sat down, wondering about what had gone wrong and unsure of what I could do to have better conferences. Like all of us who start conferring with student writers, I had a lot to learn to be more successful. I needed to understand the underlying principles that shape writing conferences, as well as the teaching moves that experienced writing teachers make in conference after conference.
So as we can see, even the masters had to start somewhere. So we hope that you'll dive in. This is the text that we really wanted to suggest if you wanted to pick one to get started. Writing conferences, that book gives you access to 28 different conferences, excuse me, from kindergarten through 8th grade, actually. And Carl is a realist that, you know, you're going to get students that don't say much in the conference or say, "No, I'm done with this piece. I don't want to make it better." Or they'll tell you what they'd like to work on, and it's not really something that you think that they need at that time. So there are certain moves that you can make and get. The more you do this, the more it will come to you quickly. But Carl's advice is basically, if you don't know what to say, keep the focus on focus and elaboration. So you'll see, you know, your own students' writings often go all over the place. So helping them to focus their writing is a huge focus for instruction, as well as working on adding more details and organizing the structure better. And it's also helpful if you have a few pet questions in your toolkit. So even if you put it on a card, starting out with "How's it going" is great, but if the conference isn't going well, then you just keep going. Lots of questions. Well, what do you think is going well with your writing today? What are you working on to improve your writing? What else are you doing as a writer? If they come up with something that you'd rather not pursue, what else? Tell me more. What can I help you with? Also, those anchor charts that you use in your mini lessons, having them at the ready to help kind of prod them along and what they could be working on is also a great strategy. And a tip is include in your mini lessons teaching kids how to join you in a conference and fully participate. So we hope that you're encouraged to dive in and realize that this is an art. Conferring is an art, and it's going to take time to develop. But hopefully you will embrace the value of conferring, especially in this pandemic time when relationships are so important. And having that one-on-one time with you on a specific focus is going to be so valuable.
All right, with that, we would just like to thank you for coming and to ask you just to take a moment to give us a little bit of feedback. If you are attending live with us today, Judy will put a link into the chat that you can just follow. But if you're watching this recorded version, we'd still love your feedback. And so we've got the tinyurl.com/blitzrisa or the QR code, whichever is easier for you. We would value your feedback, whether you're watching that today or 2 years from now. We always want to do better and to improve, so you can help us do that through your feedback. We also just want to remind you that we are here to support and serve you. At Wayne Risa, we want to help in whatever ways we can, so please feel free to reach out to us. If you're interested in literacy support, Debbie and I are here for you. Whatever you might need, never hesitate to reach out via email or Twitter. And Judy is your resource for all things instructional technology. She is such an expert and has so much knowledge. Feel free to reach out to her with any questions you might have as you move into remote teaching. Lastly, we just want to invite those of you who are interested in facilitating a session similar to this within your own context, within your own school or district, to join us for a facilitator's debrief. So please don't feel like you need to do that, but if you think that you might actually want to present this information on your own, we want to give you an opportunity to ask us questions and just access all of our resources. So if that sounds like you, we have a tiny URL up there that you can follow to our Zoom link. You'll just need to give us just a moment to navigate there ourselves. So that'll take us just a moment to get into that new Zoom link. And if that doesn't work for you, please just jot down my email address, wagnerm@risa.net. And if you send me an email in the next few minutes, you'll get an automatic reply with a direct link to that Zoom session. So if for some reason it doesn't work, you get kicked off, I would encourage you just to email me and you'll get that automatic reply right back that shows you how to join with us. So again, thank you so much for being here. Please let us know if there's anything we can do, and we're going to go ahead and end this session, and we'll meet with those interested in facilitating in just a moment on that other Zoom link.
Happy conferring, everybody.